Hey guys, it's Tyler. A few weeks ago, Matt from the Tomb of Lime Gaming made a video called The Cinematic Ideal in Role-Playing Games. And overall, I thought it was a fantastic video, and he brought up a few interesting points, particularly on tactical combat, realistic combat, and cinematic combat, which I'm going to break down as three different things. He makes a point that I largely agree with, which is that the more realistic and the more simulationist that you try to make combat, the less realistic it's actually going to feel. I totally agree with that. When you make these things super simulationist, crunchy, Shadowrun 5th edition, 4th edition, 6th edition, Pathfinder 1st edition and 2nd edition rules as written, pretty much any D20 system, Dungeons and Dragons, if you try to run it rules as written, Burning Wheel, they, on paper, should be more realistic. Hackmaster 4th edition makes fun of this sort of concept by having the D10,000 critical hit tables, where obviously it's way more realistic to have myriad options of things that can happen to you whenever you get stabbed or hit with a club or shot with an arrow, etc. But it misses maybe the most important part of that realism, which is when you get stabbed or beat with a club or shot with an arrow, it takes a fifth of a second, maybe. In real life, your average reaction time is 200 milliseconds or so. Obviously, we have to slow it down, right? Movie and cinematic combat cannot be as realistic as actual combat, but nor can a board games, nor can a role-playing games. There is a sort of flaw in the cinematic combat ideal of it's fast-paced. And I hear very often, Shauner has been doing videos of this guy that's simplifying and making GURPS combat faster. You'll see a million ways to run D&D combat faster. And yes, the killed pacing is an important factor to making tactical combat not very fun, not very interesting, not very realistic, ironically. It's not the only factor. I think if you have a 30-minute combat that's interesting, that's better than having a 5-minute combat that went by quickly and the pacing was good, but nothing really interesting happened. That's the base problem of combat in most tabletop RPGs, I think, not the pacing. The problem is that 2 hours are spent fighting some goblins, which are not communicative, not attacking you for any particular reason. You're not attacking them for any particular reason. The GM just said roll initiative, and now all of a sudden, oh, okay, all of my skills are combat, so I guess I fight them, because that's what you do. When you have a reason to fight the other person, let's say, something very realistic, a real event that happened, the first UFC Grand Finals, I want to say it was Ken Shamrock versus Hoist Gracie. I'm probably misremembering which Gracie it was, though. Anyway, the point is, that fight lasted something like 30 minutes because there were no round timers and there was no rule that said you had to advance the fight yet. Despite being realistic, that was very uninteresting. So they changed the rules to make it more interesting. Ultimately, when you're playing a game, one of the primary goals of playing a game is to get some enjoyment out of it. So you need to ask yourself, and especially your players, your fellow players, your GM, whatever your position happens to be, what is it that you derive enjoyment from in playing these games? If your enjoyment is seeing a very crunchy tactical simulationist thing, well, maybe then, yeah, a 30-minute plus combat is quite realistic. It's a thing that could actually happen. So fast pacing doesn't necessarily equal realistic, nor does fast pacing necessarily equal good. But I would say that if you do have the slow pacing, there needs to be a reason for it, right? The original UFC is generally regarded as quite boring because it was two dudes hugging on the ground. You know, if you were to role play that out in game mechanics terms, it would be, one guy takes his turn, he rolls, he succeeds to maintain top position. The other guy rolls, he succeeds to prevent the other guy from advancing past top position. And then you're stuck there. And you roll back and forth, and you do that for 30 minutes until one person finally fails a roll. Perhaps realistic, not very interesting though, because they were stuck in a tactical. They basically were both put in check at the same time, and you had to just keep moving, your king back and forth in and out of check. That is to say, if Hoist lets go, Shamrock gets up, starts beating him on the ground and pound. The moment Shamrock gives him any space, he's going to get armbarred or choked out or something by Gracie. And they both know this, so neither of them are creating space. Tactically, they both agree to sit there because it's the safest option. It's also the least interesting option, though. And that, I think, is the crux here, is you need to be making, as a player, as a game master, not the correct decisions all of the time. Being tactical means trying to make at least, the correct decisions all the time with the information that you have available. But characters on a micro level, when you zoom into a single character, which is kind of the beauty of an RPG, I think, versus something else. Or a few characters in the case of Dungeon Crawl Classics, but one at a time, right? You need to understand that it's impossible to make the correct decision all the time. And in that case, on the macro scale of things, the correct decisions were the wrong decisions because nobody wanted to watch that. They led to the rules changing. Just like the rules of an RPG need to change if the correct decision is to play a 30-minute uninteresting combat instead of a 5-minute interesting combat or a 1-hour interesting combat, right? The timing really, we compare a lot, when do you see an hour-long fight scene in a movie? Well, not very often, but you do have things like John Wick, which are bits of dialogue, bits of exposition, then a fight scene, then a fight scene, then a fight scene, then bits of dialogue, bits of exposition, then a fight scene. And the fighting is pretty constant. That isn't to say that you're stuck in a combat mode constantly. Again, that's another thing that games will try to play off as realistic, or simulationist, and it's really not. I don't suddenly enter a combat mode where I suddenly cannot speak anymore, or I can't climb something, or I can't use my other skills because I'm in combat with somebody. I can, choose to throw a punch right now and continue talking with you, right? Throw an elbow, whatever. It's so these modes, the more crunch you add, you need to ask yourself, is that adding intrigue, interest, fun at its basis form, in addition to realism? Why are you adding the realism? Matt points out that it's very difficult to impossible to fully simulate something like combat with a tabletop RPG. I agree. I think we should also ask ourselves, though, why are we trying? Because there's a thing called sparring, which is a much better way to simulate combat between on the individual scale, if that's what our goal is here, right? Obviously, we couldn't do it with magic, but then you go, we couldn't simulate that at all because we don't know what magic is. We could emulate it, I suppose. And I like hard magic systems, but that's because the hard magic system adds some interest to the game, right? It's, on the flip side, a light rule system where things are not trying to simulate very hard and just hand wave the, oh, I don't have to explain it, it's magic. That falls apart very quickly, right? Because then the people in the world start to think, well, nobody's studied this to figure out how it works? No, it is simply beyond our understanding. It's beyond everyone's understanding? Really? Everybody just gave up? Nobody's even trying. Nobody has like a wrong theory about how the magic works in the universe. So that doesn't sit well with me either. I tend to gravitate towards crunchier games because it's easier to cut away at the chaff than it is to add from nothing, for me at least. There's some other considerations, obviously, but yeah, effectively, if you're adding, we can see this in video games now too. We're adding, perks and abilities and stuff you can pick up to make you 5% better at something. And yeah, at the end of the day, if I've, had a really good 4-hour training session, I might be 1% or 2 better at sword fighting after I'm done teaching a class. Is that particularly interesting? No, and that's why a lot of people stop doing martial arts after a year or two, is they don't, that little incremental increase is just, it can be dissatisfying unless you have the discipline to sit through with it. We have a limited time in the day, so when you're improving at something that's fake, you're improving at your character's improving at their fake sword fighting skill. That's really dissatisfying for it to be going that slow. We need to have some concessions for realism. Slow improvement is interesting. There's whole movies about the hero's journey and the training arcs. Drunken Master 2, whole series of movies there. Arguably, the entirety of the Hong Kong action genre is hero gets ass kicked, hero does training for a third to half of the movie, then hero comes back. So the improvement is there, but it obviously happens way faster than it does in real life. So there is something to be said about pacing mattering for realism. That being said, also, there are things that are paced very, very slowly that are some of my favorite things ever. The very slow character building, drama, world building of hard sci-fi series, real robot genres like Zeta Gundam or Ghost in the Shell standalone complex, where there's all of these pieces coming together. There's sort of fight scenes that seem to be cool for the sake of cool until the fight scene's over, and then you're like, that's what's happening here. Or, episodes later, it's like, do you remember that guy you killed? Yeah, when he died, like, touched a thing on the side of your head, and nobody noticed it, but it left like a little implant thing. Now your robot arm's malfunctioning and going crazy. Deus Ex Human Revolution did that. A seemingly benign thing. You go to an upgrade station to get the latest firmware, and then, and then 30 minutes, an hour later in gameplay, all of a sudden your vision's going crazy, everything's slowed down and sluggish, and it makes the fight way harder. There's no upside to doing that, which makes it not particularly interesting, right? And that's another problem with realism that doesn't often get spoken about, is games like Escape from Tarkov try to be fairly realistic, and the problem is it's not very fun to spawn in and then die to a guy 500 meters away that you never saw. These are two-way mediums games, and when you allow for things like that amount of realism, they quickly become one-way mediums. They quickly leave the players asking, well, if you were just going to do that, why did you even use the rules and not just use rule 0, rocks fall, we all die, right? Hopefully that gives you guys some ideas behind realism as it fights and bounces off of pacing and intrigue and goodness in your RPGs and in movies for that matter, right? In anything, reality is very interesting. I think the trouble is that people on the rules light side of things, the it's just a game, it's just magic, etc., are missing the parts where reality can be very interesting and give you some depth, something to bite into, crunch, as we call it. And on the crunchy end of things, people forget that they make it more real for the sake of making it more real, but also if your goal is to do that, I would highly suggest taking some martial arts classes and seeing how long you have to think about the fist that's coming towards your face, or the sword, or ghost shooting, especially something like cowboy action shooting, or 3-gun matches, 2-gun matches, backup gun matches. Have a shot clock, not just shooting at targets, but and that's sort of the difference, right? Is your tactical gaming is target shooting, no timer. Your cinematic gaming is more like cowboy action. And then what I want to do is somewhere in the middle with your, 2-gun, 3-gun matches, where it's a little more realistic. It's you're not shooting 22s. You're aiming to. You're not just dumping 12 rounds onto the same target. You're having to move. It's more realistic, but there is still that timer there. There is still that reflection of pressure, but also it's fun. You can show up to the 3-gun or the 2-gun match with some absolutely ridiculous gun that is not gonna do well. You can show up with a character that's insane, that does not always come up with the tactically correct decisions, and handle that realistically. Longer video. I'm still getting back into trying to do videos, avoiding the ums and ahs, and getting my thoughts more concise out here. This was never intended to be anything more than a rambly video, and to say that thanks for the good videos, Matt, and thanks to the 5 or so new subscribers since last I uploaded. Next video on revolvers, I think? Perhaps? Or HEMA stuff? Let me know what you're interested in the comments on the RPG, martial arts, etc. front. I'm a variety channel after all. Thanks to all new viewers as well. See you guys.